Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our virtual audience and to those of you in the room with us tonight. For our program, Pay Gaps Are Real. Is pay transparency the answer? My name is Esther Bigler, and I direct the Labor and Employment Law program here at ILR. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the very first program sponsored by our newest center, CARO, the Center for Applied Research on Work, focused on applied research that will serve as an engine for ILR to elevate, coordinate, and expand our services. One of CARO's primary features is the Yang Workability Incubator, which will allow us to seed and nurture new initiatives that leverage applied research to tackle the meat of ILR, the pressing work, employment, and labor challenges of our time. I bring you greetings from Associate Dean Ariel Evgar, who is the founding director, who wanted to be here tonight, but I edged him out so I could do the introduction. He will also be, on November 1st, the first David M. Cohen Professor, a newly endowed professorship in labor relations. In addition to the Labor and Employment Law program and the Center for Applied Research on Work, this program is co-sponsored by the Institute for Compensation Studies, directed by my colleague, Diane Burton. She is the Joseph R. Rich Professor of Human Resources. She's also the academic director of the Institute and my friend. She will be moderating this panel, which you will hear afterwards. Also, as a co-sponsor is the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business. Starting November 1, and you know what? It's next week. I thought to myself, oh my God. New York City employers will be required to disclose minimum and maximum salaries when advertising for job openings. Will the change narrow the gender and racial pay gaps? Will it give more knowledge and negotiating power to employees applying for these jobs? Will it be detrimental to companies? The gap is real. For example, women earn only 83 cents for every dollar earned by men. Black women in 2020 were paid 58% of what non-Hispanic white men were paid. Black men earn 87 cents for every dollar earned by white men, while Latino men earn 91 cents. A big difference when you compound it year after year after year. So we've tried to fix this problem before. First, we had the Equal Pay Act, which has been in effect since 1963. It prohibits wage discrimination on the basis of only sex. But who can forget those famous words that we all talked about? Because the act applies to jobs which require equal skill, effort, responsibility, and which are performed under similar circumstances. Didn't help much. So that was followed shortly thereafter by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Under Title VII, an employer cannot discriminate against any individual with respect to their compensation, a lot of other things too, because of such individuals' race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Not fixed yet. This was followed by the comparable worth theory that some of you may remember, asking what is the worth of the job to society? Remember, we compared the salaries of teachers, a female profession, to sanitation workers, a male profession, wanting to know why were teachers paid less than sanitation workers. That theory didn't go very far. So that brings us closer to current day. New York City passed a law which made it against the law to ask a job applicant their current salary. So they won't have their lower salary baked in to the new job. But we still needed more help to get rid of that gap. So the question is, which we're going to try to answer tonight, will wage transparency be the answer to this intractable problem? And what impact will it have on the workplace? Tonight, we are taking a deep dive into this question, first with my friend Peter Bamberger, and then with a panel moderated by Professor Diane Burton, with experts who are on the ground. They are the boots on the ground, dealing with this issue every single day. The panel will be followed by a Q&A session. And so if you're here with us virtually, depending on which virtual stream you're on, please put your questions in the stream and we'll be monitoring them and we'll be able to answer those questions. And certainly for those of you who are in the audience here with us tonight, we want to answer your questions as well. Peter Bamberger is a Cornell PhD, another ILR, so to speak. He is the Domberger Professor of Management at Tel Aviv University's Coller School of Management and Research, and Research Director of the ILR School Smithers Institute. His research examines pay communication and compensation strategies, pro-social behavior, occupational health, psychology, cognitive implications of discrete workplaces, and events such as rudeness and gratitude. I wonder if my gratitude journal is really helping me, Peter. I'll talk to you about it afterwards. He has many, many books to his credit. Some of them include Human Resource Strategy, Exposing Pay, How Pay Transparency and Disclosure Impacts Employees, Employers, and Societies in Which We Live. He has published over 100 referee journal articles. He currently serves as the Vice President of the Academy of Management. Tonight, he will share evidence-based insights from his forthcoming book published by Oxford University Press, Exposing Pay, Pay Transparency and What It Means for Employees, Employers, and Public Policy. Exposing Pay presents findings regarding the impact of the various forms of pay transparency on the outcomes at work, whether you're an employee or an employer. He will give us an honest assessment of the good and the bad of pay transparency. Peter, it's all yours.
Thanks very much. I got into this area a little bit by accident. A couple of MBA students years ago asked me whether I thought pay transparency was a good thing or a bad thing. And I said, what's pay transparency? Because we're going back, well, a good 15, 20 years. And I decided I needed to start looking at this, and I saw that the research was much older, like there had been a gap since the 1960s. So I started looking at this thing, and I realized first thing that this was not a new topic. And I'm going to be going like this quite a bit to make the slides come up. There we go. Next one. So when you look at history, this topic is well over 100 years old, right? So the first case about this whole issue of pay transparency emerges in Vanity Fair magazine, which is still out there. And you can see the memo that was written by management at Vanity Fair because they were concerned that employees were talking about their pay with one another. So the response of some of these writers, some of whom were very, very well respected at the time, someone named Richard Benchley, for example, was one of them, was not to violate the memo. They saw the memo, and the next day they all came in wearing placards. And written on their placard was their salary. So they weren't violating the memo. And this was discussed widely at the time. And then through the years, it became an even hotter issue as we moved towards personal contracts. Already in the 1960s, there's a great episode. I don't know how many of you are fans of Mad Men. I am. There's a great episode in Mad Men about one of these advertising managers who by accident gets somebody else's payslip along with his, and by accident opens that payslip and realizes that this other person is making a lot more money than he is. And he goes to his boss and he says, I want a raise. And the boss says, how much do you want? And he says, I want to get this amount of money. And the boss, which is exactly what the payslip showed. And the boss says, that's crazy. No one around here gets anywhere near that amount of money, right? And they settle halfway in between. So lots and lots of stories about this. Next slide. And when you look at the popular management press, you can see that this is a very contentious issue and has been for years. But what's also pretty obvious already back when I started looking at it 15, 20 years ago was that there was hardly any evidence for any of these claims. So if you look at some of these claims, you could see that a lot of managers were talking about the dangers of pay transparency and the benefits of pay secrecy. One of them being a really important argument being that pay secrecy allows managers to more efficiently allocate resources, rewards, right? Because if pay is transparent, they're going to be under pressure to do this in a non-rational way, right? And if everything is secret, they can just be rational, as we know that all managers are, and allocate pay effectively, efficiently. So that was argument number one. Argument number two is that normally we don't think about anybody else's pay at work, right? Managers would argue that as long as pay is secret, we never, ever think about anyone else's pay. So I love to do this with my MBA students. And I ask them the name of the person who works next to them in the same job. And they tell me the name. I said, any idea how much they make? No. Do you ever think about it? All the time, right? They're always thinking about it. But the argument at the time was, if it's not out there, no one thinks about it, there's no jealousy, no envy, and everything is fine. And if you do make it transparent, there's a high degree of envy, and that could hurt collaboration. Third argument in favor of secrecy is that the minute you make pay transparent, people can find out how much others are making. And if they're not going to get that, they're going to leave. So now where talent is so hard to get, this could be very problematic. It hurts retention. And finally, labor costs. If pay is transparent, everybody's asking for a raise and your labor costs go up, especially if you want to prevent turnover. So these are some really, really strong arguments that were made over the years in favor of pay secrecy. In favor of pay transparency, you have some equally strong statements that were made already years ago, that transparency was the key to reducing the gender and racial pay gap that we've heard about. That transparency is important, particularly in the kind of HR climates that we try to create nowadays that are based more on commitment and identity, that are really more trust-based. And if you want to have more of a family-oriented kind of a workplace culture, when we talk about families without transparency, you're largely talking about dysfunctional families, right? So essentially, we need transparency to build trust in a functional family-type workplace. Another one was that, based on some social psychological theories, that if you give employees a sense of transparency and trust, they will reciprocate, show them fairness, and they will show performance in return, right? This is called a fair process effect. And then finally, that there may be some turnover with pay transparency, but it's good turnover, because the bad performers who are getting paid less are the ones who are likely to leave. And who are you stuck with? The great performers. And is that a terrible thing for managers, for companies? No, that's a good thing. That's called positive sorting. So which is it? Slide, right? So I would talk about this with my students, and things would get very, very complex, because they would all talk about different forms of pay transparency. And when you look at the literature as well, even when we started doing some research on it, they complicated this issue even further, the good and the bad, by talking about different types of transparency without ever recognizing that they were talking about different types of transparency. So let's make it simple. When we talk about transparency, we're talking about three different forms of transparency. The first one is procedural, or what I call process pay transparency. And this has to do with the amount of information organizations provide to their employees about the pay process. How do we make pay decisions, right? Why is it that some people may be paid more than others? You may think this is a no-brainer, but when you look at the data, you'll see that there are many, many employees that don't even get a pay slip, that don't even have any idea what they're going to be paid from month to month, no less why it is that they're getting paid this way. So this is step number one. Let's call that 1A. 1B, which is also quite rudimentary, is what we call communication pay transparency. And this has to do with restrictions that employers might put on employees to talk about pay, just like Vanity Fair magazine did 100 years ago. So employees that are covered by the National Labor Relations Act have had protection from this type of regulation since the 1930s. But most employees have no idea about this. And most managers, I was just in Washington visiting family, and I asked my niece, who's a new construction supervisor, what would you do if two of your employees started talking about their pay? She says, well, in our company, they're not supposed to do that. What would you do? I would give them a warning, and if they continue doing it, I would fire them, right? I said, okay, well, we need to do some education here, right? Clueless, absolutely clueless, right? So there have been numerous court cases up to the Supreme Court about this. So this is kind of a no-brainer, except that it is very much still an issue in many, many organizations. And there's still questions about how far companies can go to discourage employees from talking. Is that legal, or is that we have our legal people here, and they'll tell us a little bit about that, I hope. The third form is actually the most interesting, is emerging as the most, I think, the most important issue, and that has to do with actual distributive transparency, which is the degree to which companies actually provide actual pay information, whether that's done on an aggregate level or individual level. Okay, so 3 different forms. So then again, the question, is it good or bad? And the answer I always give is yes. And the reason I give that answer of yes is because it depends to a large extent which type of pay transparency, there we go, we're talking about. It depends who the stakeholders are, and most importantly, it depends quite a bit on what the outcome is that we're interested in. What are we trying to achieve with pay transparency? So in my research over the years, I've been looking at a whole bunch of these and others, you can see up there, these and other outcomes. I don't know if I'm going to have time to get through all of them, but I'll try to say a couple of words about all of them. So the first thing that interested me was this issue, the number 1 on the list. What's the impact on individual task performance? Does it help or hurt motivation when pay is transparent? So the first thing I did is I went to a bunch of companies and I said, hey, I'd like to run an experiment in your company. I'd like to randomize your employees, and I'd like to make pay transparent for some and keep pay secret for others. I didn't get a lot of takers, and I'm still trying to figure out why, right? Companies don't like to let people like me come in and experiment with their pay systems. So I had to go into a lab, and I had to get rather creative about how I actually experiment with this stuff, because experiments are the best way to actually gain knowledge about phenomena, much better than surveys. So I started with some experiments, and the first one that, whoops, go back, sorry. I shouldn't move my hands so much. So the first way I started thinking about this is that, again, that notion of fairness. If I'm transparent with my pay to my employees, they're going to be good to me and they're going to work harder. So this is that fairness hypothesis, the reciprocation hypothesis. And I tried that, and it kind of worked for people that were very, very sensitive about equity and fairness. Usually the oldest male child in a family, right? Because those are the ones that are highly equity sensitive, right? So for those people, transparency actually did have a positive effect, but in everyone else, it didn't. So I had to get a little bit smarter. And I started looking at some of the early research that was done in the 60s. And what I came up with from that early research in the 60s is that it has a lot more to do with performance pay instrumentalities, or the perception about how much I gain by working harder. So when I looked at that research in the 1960s that was done by Ed Lawler from USC, and then my teacher in the ILR school of compensation, George Milkovich, what I saw were consistent findings that when we asked employees how much their superiors make, they underestimate how much their superiors are making, right? Superiors are making $1 million a year. They assume that they're making $800,000 a year. And this is not only research from the late 60s and early 70s, this was just replicated in an Indonesian bank by a couple of Harvard economists, just before the pandemic. So this doesn't seem to go away. And then when we look at what the perceptions are of coworkers' pay, I guess I got the slides backwards here, sorry about that. Coworkers' pay, so this is the supervisor's pay. The coworkers' pay, we tend to overestimate how much our coworkers are making. So this has an interesting result, right? So my bosses are contributing a lot, but I perceive their pay as lower than what they're actually contributing. And the ones that are contributing less, right, like me, I actually perceive their rewards as higher than what they are. So actually what I'm doing is I'm scrunching down, I'm compressing those performance pay instrumentalities. What that actually means is that extra effort on my part is not going to be rewarded from here to here, right? That extra boost of effort is not going to get my pay up to here. It's actually going to get me from here to here, which means I'm less motivated. And we actually saw this in a couple of studies that we did in a variety of, in both Israel as well as Singapore when we ran these experiments. So overall, we see a benefit for pay transparency, and we've actually been able to capture how this works. And it works primarily by shifting, by expanding to the differentials, to what the perceptions of the differentials to what they really are. Okay. So that's the first set of studies we did. Second set, we started looking at this issue of, sorry, another aspect of performance, which has to do with contextual performance, what some people called organizational citizenship behavior, which has to do with helping and collaboration. And here's that envy argument. So remember I said before that people, managers believe that if you keep pay secret, no one thinks about pay. In fact, everybody thinks about pay. So why should transparency make a difference? So if you look at some of the research of behavioral economists like Thaler and people like that, what you'll see is that there's this thing called the certainty effect. And what happens when pay is transparent, we slam in front of your face vivid evidence that you're being paid potentially less than somebody else. Now you can't dismiss it, you can't deny it, you can't say, well, you know, I'm hoping next year I'll get the raise. It's in your face, and that has an impact. And we demonstrate that, in fact, here's some of the bad news, transparency does actually increase envy. And it's not because people don't think about it, it's more because they can't dismiss it. And that envy, unfortunately, has an impact as well. It doesn't have an impact on people's refusal to help other people when they're asked to help. But when we studied its impact on what we call unsolicited helping, which means you see that a coworker is having some trouble with something, do you go over there and actually lend a hand? And the answer is when there's higher envy as a result of pay transparency, the answer is no, right? Diminished level. So this is another problem with pay transparency. Another, sorry, that was the slide for that, but we're going to skip over that. Questions about retention. Is it help or hurt retention? So David Card, who's an economist at Berkeley, actually did a natural experiment on this. Pay became transparent for California state workers about 10 years ago. And he ran a little experiment with professors in the UC system, most of whom had no idea that pay was transparent. So he sent half of them randomized an article about pay transparency with a link to the website where they could see everybody else's paid, and the others know something else about administrators' pay or something. And then he came back 2 weeks later, asked them about their intentions to leave. He came back 2 years later. So intentions to leave were higher in the transparency case. And in fact, turnover was higher. There were fewer professors in the transparency condition that were still in the UC system 2 years later. So clearly transparency hurts retention. Except when I did some of my experimental work, what I found was that at least for the better performers, it actually boosted retention. And then when I looked at David Card's results, I found that the people that actually left the UC system were the poorer performers, the professors that, you've heard the saying, publish or perish. So these were the ones that published less, and they voluntarily perished. They weren't there anymore. Positive sorting, you can think about it in that way. We did another study using data from China, very, very similar results, both at the individual and at the organizational level. We found that in organizations where there was a climate of fairness, pay transparency boosted the retention of employees. Where there was a perception of unfairness in pay, pay transparency actually hurt retention, turnover rates were higher, and secrecy was actually beneficial to holding on to performers. So a lot of this has to do with people's perception of where they are and how fair the overall system is. If the perception of pay is fair in the system, transparency benefits. If the perception of fairness, the climate of fairness is poor, unfair, then perhaps organizations really are better off with a system of pay secrecy in order to retain their employees in general, good or bad. All right, let's move to another one. Counterproductive work behavior. This has to do with theft. It has to do with mistreating other employees. And as you can see, violence in the workplace, the costs are relatively high. What happens when we make pay transparent with counterproductive work behavior? So right away, if we make pay transparent and people see that others are making more than them, they start to behave like the monkeys in this clip. Do we have the clip?
Getting grape and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Getting me out of the cage, right? We looked at both counterproductive work behavior to the organization and against coworkers who had nothing to do with pay inequity, right? This is an organizational thing. Why should I mistreat my coworker? Now we're not talking about helping, we're talking about mistreatment. So the first thing we looked at was what was the impact on counterproductive work behavior towards the organization. We were the organization in this experiment. Let's flip. And we gave employees under these two conditions, secrecy or transparency, an opportunity to cheat us in the study that we were doing. And sure enough, where we showed distributed pay transparency and they saw different amounts of pay, lower perceptions of fairness, higher cheating against us. We did the same thing with pay process transparency, one condition where we gave them more information about how they were being paid, the other condition, no. And pay process or procedural justice, fairness, about perceptions of fairness about procedures in the organization went up, and the cheating was lower in this condition, okay? And then we looked at what happens in terms of cheating or ripping off a partner, and we used what's called an ultimatum game, something that economists do quite frequently. Same conditions, and what we found is that people who were under conditions of pay transparency but were at the lower end of that pay ladder engaged in lying towards their coworker, and then when they had a choice of how they actually distributed rewards, distributed less to their coworkers. Okay, and again, the coworkers had nothing to do with it. This was a case of kicking the dog. Okay. So part of it may have to do with social mindfulness and the sort of semi or unconscious implications of what happens when pay is transparent and you see that you're at the bottom end. Most recent study we did was looking at what happens to pay systems and pay dispersion. This is probably the most interesting one. We did a study in China of about 100 small, medium-sized enterprises, looking at the implications of going more transparent. And what we found was what economists are now finding as well, other economists are finding, that when pay becomes transparent, next slide, pay dispersion goes down. This is what I was talking about early on in terms of the efficiency of rewarding employees, right? Better performers make more money, in theory, but when pay becomes transparent, what happens when we're under the spotlight? We try to hide, right? What happens when you put a manager under the spotlight? They try to get away from these contentious environments, and they seem to give more or less everyone the same amount of pay. We then looked at what happens in response to this pay compression. We found something very interesting in these Chinese firms. We found that the employees under these conditions of pay compression asked their employers for all sorts of what we call, or what the literature calls, idiosyncratic deals. These are types of benefits having to do with development, like send me to Hawaii for a week of training, right? Or let me work more from home. And what we found is that in 50% of the cases where employees asked for these idiosyncratic deals in China, they were granted. Ask and you shall receive, okay? So what's actually happening is that with pay transparency, we're shifting the rewards, and benefits account for about 30% of rewards at least in the US. We're shifting rewards from pay under the spotlight to another area called benefits, which is not transparent. And there's some really interesting recent research that's showing that, particularly in terms of benefits, we have massive gender pay gaps. Some sociologists showed that recently. All right, let's talk about some of the good news. So the good news in terms of these equity gaps is that when we look at some of these natural experiments that were done in other places outside of the US, and we're doing one now based on the California law, what we find is that in Denmark, the law was passed in 2016 using what's called a difference in differences design, where we look at companies that are under the law and companies that aren't roughly the same size. We see a decline in the pay gap very quickly after this law is passed. Canadian study looking at universities, we find a 30% reduction in the pay gap. So it does reduce the pay gap. There's very little evidence that would counter, there's no evidence that counters that. It has that effect. But, and it also reduces income inequality more generally. If you look at what happens in Norway, where everybody can see their neighbor's tax returns. Wouldn't that be fun? But one of the effects really is this pay compression issue. And Moss, who's another economist at Berkeley, and Todd Zenger, who's a colleague, a friend of mine, found that one of the things that happens that's an adverse effect of all of this is that pay compression, and that we reward performance less. And when we reward performance less, contrary to what I've been finding, the better performers leave, right? We have empirical data from this. Confused yet? I hope so, because this is a really confusing issue. And there, like I said, is pay transparency good or bad? The answer is yes, right? It's good and bad, and we're just at the cusp of understanding a little bit of how this stuff works. What does it mean for those of you that are practitioners? Well, when it comes to communication pay transparency, it's a no-brainer, as I said. Don't even try to restrict communication and disclosure by employees. When it comes to pay process transparency, we found no unintended negative consequences so far in our research. The benefits are clear, and there doesn't seem to be any negative effect, except that managers have to work a little bit hard to be more accountable, right? And when it comes to distributed pay transparency, which is really the topic of what we're talking about, what's coming down the road in New York City, we certainly see some problems with individualized disclosures. But when it comes to these disclosure of ranges, that's an area that we've yet to really study, and this is what we need to be looking at. So, jury's still out. That's about it. Thanks.
Peter, stay. I want to invite you to the panel. Yes, please. Welcome. You want to fix our slides?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm Diane Burton. I asked to introduce me earlier. Thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to invite our panelists up to the podium, starting first with Jacqueline Ebanks. Jacqueline's the Executive Director of the New York City Commission on Gender Equity. Then we have Ivandro Gigante, a partner at Proskauer, and he's in the Labor and Employment Law Department. And then Brian Levine, who's a partner at Mercer and leads the workforce analytics practice. And I have my experts on the table, up here at the table, and I hope we're going to be able to have a conversation. I know this feels a little bit Senate hearing-like, and so we'll try and make it a little bit informal, and I hope we can talk to each other a little bit. But I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists a question. So Jacqueline, we heard from Esta that this new law starting just in a couple of days, employers that have 4 or more employees, or 1 or more domestic workers advertising jobs in New York City have to include a good faith salary range for every job, promotion, and transfer opportunity that they advertise. And so this is an amendment to the New York City Civil Rights Law, and this is the result of many years of hard work that you've been involved with. So can you give us a little bit of the background on this and explain why you thought this needed to be mandated?
Well, thank you so much. And it's a really great honor to be here and wonderful to hear your research, Peter. The Commission on Gender Equity is created to work across all of New York City agencies to dismantle barriers to equity and to create processes that help us develop and implement gender equitable policies and practices using an intersectional lens. We recognize that this issue of gender equity is a complex matter. We have three guiding principles when we do our work. One is that gender is diverse. And so we're talking about this issue as we look at gender identity and gender expression. The other is that we operate with an intersectional lens, right? We talk about developing policies and programs that improve outcomes for girls, women, intersex, transgender, gender non-binary, gender non-conforming New Yorkers. And then we link that to issues of race, age, sexual orientation, disability, and it goes on. I'm going to miss one, so I'm going to stop. And then, and last but not least, the city needs to lead. By that, we mean that as an employer, we ought to demonstrate that we are serving our workforce with these gender equitable policies and practices as we develop laws and require the other sectors to be in alignment. So we also have three areas of focus, and this is really important. We do our work to advance economic mobility and opportunity, improve health and reproductive justice, and to increase safety for all New Yorkers. Within our economic mobility area, we identified pay equity as central to creating opportunities for individuals in New York to thrive, right? And so for us, we had to look at this journey that Esther laid out so clearly. Since, and Peter said, 1919, we've been in this journey to ensure that women's work primarily is equally valued and equally compensated in our workforce. That's the journey. And so we have been chopping and chipping away at this. 2017, we had the salary history ban. We still have yet to determine if that has been affected and if so, to what extent. And so what's very important to us is when we look at this pay transparency bill, it is happening in concert with all these other laws that have passed and gone before. So the impact is not solely about the pay transparency bill, but have we been closing this opportunity to devalue and undervalue women's work to such an extent that we can earn what the standard being white males earn in 12 months in the same time period for comparable work, right? That's where we're going. And so that's the journey. Let me point out one gap. We have ignored LGBTQ individuals. There's no analysis around pay and sexual orientation, and we have simply not counted LGBTQ individuals in our workforce. So that's additional work yet to be done as we look at this piece of work.
Thank you. Evandra, let me turn to you because we've heard now that this is there's a long history of pay-related legislation, and so how do you see this kind of local law changing the legal landscape, and how do you expect it to impact your work as an attorney?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I also appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you this evening and to be back at ILR, my old stomping grounds. So I think what I'll say on a more sort of granular level is that the goal of this law is important. And it's important to the employers that I work with on a daily basis. That is to close that gender pay equity gap that Jackie was talking about. How we accomplish that on a day-to-day basis, of course, depends on the circumstances of each individual employer. But in New York City, our employers, my clients, are going to have to comply with this new law starting next week. And I think from what I'm seeing on the ground is employers thinking through the mechanics of how they're going to implement this statute in their postings that they're going to put up next week, right? How are they going to create these pay ranges? What do they look like? What are they based on? Are they based on the salaries of incumbent employees in their workforce? Are they based on what market forces are out there and drive the demand in the workplace for different employees at different levels? How are they going to reconcile those numbers? Because they're not always the same, right? And are they doing it in a way that meets the statutory requirement of constructing a range that the employer believes in good faith they would pay for this particular position? So there's a lot of mechanics that go into this. Of course, there's the mechanics around what's an advertisement, under what circumstances do I actually need to create this range? What if I go to a headhunter? What if I'm advertising for a job that could be worked in New York, but could also be worked in New Mexico, right? Because nowadays, remote work is so prevalent and people aren't necessarily hiring just for jobs in New York City if they're looking for employees who can work in different parts of the country. So that's what I'm hearing on a day-to-day basis. But what I'm also seeing, I think dovetails more with what Jackie was talking about, which is what does the statute or compliance with the statute mean for me as an employer when, say, an employee comes to me and says, well, wait a minute, you just posted for my position or a position similar to mine, but that range is higher than where I am. Or I'm in that range, but I'm at the low end. Why? Right? And companies call me and say, what am I going to say to that? So we talk through, why employees are where they are, and thinking in advance, who are going to ask these, who are the people going to ask these questions, and what are our answers going to be to those questions? And if we don't have good answers to those questions, well, then we call maybe someone like Brian, right? Which is, how are we going to statistically demonstrate to people why they are where they are? And maybe it's a question of, what is our performance management system in the company, right? Does that sort of lend support for why some people are paid more or less than others? How well are we telling employees that those are the reasons why their pay may lag behind those of their colleagues, right? And so there are lots of consequential issues that come about as a result of a statute that's about a paragraph and a half long. And so that's how I think I'm seeing now the impact of this law shaping the way that I advise my clients on a day-to-day basis.
Perfect. And a perfect setup for Brian. Now, Brian, you have worked with companies for many years as a compensation consultant. How are the firms you're working with seeing this and reacting and responding?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Before today, I don't think I've met another 3-degree holder from Cornell ILR, so that's pretty cool, Peter, that now we're connected. Yeah, so I am part of a workforce analytics practice at Mercer, but I also lead our global pay equity business. And what I would tell you is that we do more than 100 studies a year. There's 100 different companies global, most of them with employees in New York City. And they are very, very active on this issue. It predates this new regulation, although in my comments, I will say how I do think this new regulation is quite helpful in a number of ways. Honestly, it stems recently a lot from shareholder pressures, activist investors pushing employers to put out information on where they stand with regard to pay equity. And by the way, activist shareholders ask for this information. Some companies put it out. Employees see that. They ask questions. And so you are part now of a virtuous cycle where companies are increasingly putting out this kind of information. In fact, if you look at a random ESG report from a leading company, you're likely to see something relating to pay equity and how they are managing diversity. So companies are getting very smart about this. They really are acting proactively on it. They know that part of their employment proposition really has to be that they are promoting equity in their workforces. What I would say too is that if you look at those disclosures, they are actually many of them in a very good position. So you'll see we pay women 99 cents on the dollar relative to men. So that's a very different statistic than the one Esther mentioned earlier. When you look at pay and you account for differences, you account for the fact that people have different levels of experience. You account for the fact that people are in different roles, you get a very different answer than the 83 cents on a dollar. Look, 99 cents is not perfect. We want that number to be 100 cents. The companies I work with want that. They also want to close that aggregate gap, which is honestly much more about representation. It's much more about the representation of women and people of color in the more senior ranks of the organization. That's what drives that. And unfortunately, pay transparency is not going to get us to a better position on that front, but it's part of the path. I will say too that the legislation I think is quite helpful in the sense that when I look at pay equity and I see why do these gaps, even after companies make significant adjustments to counter any issues that they identify, why do they reemerge? It happens at the point of hire. And the salary history bands did not eliminate that issue. So anything that we can do to help companies have greater, better processes around how they are setting pay for employees coming in the door should help us to drive better pay equity at companies. And I will say too that we do these analyses proactively for companies on an annual basis, but with this regulation, with other regulations in other jurisdictions focused on the same issue, we are doing it with more urgency to ensure that people are in the right positions in their ranges, because that is going to be a critical issue as employees are looking at where they stand in these ranges. Are we in a place that we understand? And managers have to be also able to have those conversations with employees.
So it sounds like with the large companies, you're not expecting to see big changes because there's some proactive energy here. Where will we expect to see impact? And maybe this is a question to the whole panel. Like, who's this going to really affect, and where are we going to see change?
You know, I think what we're looking for is that the worker is empowered to make informed choices about where they pursue opportunities, right? And that they have more data. That's what we're asking for, salary history band and pay transparency. I think, so for me, that's one issue. I do think there is likely to be a burden, I will say, on small businesses where the mechanics, as Eduardo was describing, did I say that right?
Evandro, that's close enough.
Evandro, sorry, was describing is they may not have the infrastructure and the capacity to do this work. And so that is an area where, you know, we have a wonderful small business department that also provides resources and support to help small businesses really navigate these goals. And I need to point out that many of these small businesses are run by persons of color and women. So really, it's also the population deeply impacted and needing to achieve pay equity. I think the other question for us becomes the issue of maintaining, as Brian said, right? So you close the gap, but how do you maintain it? So this is not a one-off. You have to have a diligence around it. And I think in the past of how we've sort of shrunk our HR departments, now all of a sudden, you know, here we go. You need to be mindful that these are core central functions in your organization. And that when we talk about salary transparency, it only talks about compensation. The issue of retention, the issue of how you recruit, the issue of representation sets the culture that helps you hold, I think, the compensation piece. And then Peter, as you talked about people moving to benefits. So one of the vulnerabilities of this law, right, is that it incentivizes the cash portion, and then the possibility of moving into secrecy or further secrecy with a benefits package is where we lose. And so we would have certainly preferred, but you know, negotiations happen, total compensation language in this bill. But I think it's a journey, as we've proven for 100 years. But that journey costs, right? And that's the factor as well. I go back to the individual. I go back to families and communities who really have to absorb this cost of lower earnings because of systems that we have institutionalized.
So just to add on, I think we can look at some other countries to get some evidence who's going to be impacted and how well it's actually working. So the sort of lower end, I would call it, regulation like we have in New York City is similar to what was adopted in Germany. In Germany, the law is a little bit more complex, like many things in Germany. And the onus is actually on the employee to raise the case, as it would be in New York City, from my understanding. And we don't see too many cases being raised in Germany. So it hasn't had that massive impact. And then you can take a case like Iceland, which is about to go towards, I think, starting January 1st, with regulated pay equity, gender pay equity, where reports have to go to the government to actually show zero unexplained variance in pay, which is a really robust mode of regulation, and reports going to a regulatory agency that will look at that. So there I would expect to see a much more profound effect.
Evandra, let me ask you to pipe in here, because do we expect the employees to bear the burden of this? Is the plaintiff's bar going to come to the forefront? How do you see enforcement playing out? Who are the actors?
Yeah, so I think just first to comment on the earlier question of, which is going to dovetail with the response here, how is this going to change the landscape? I mean, I think that it's in some ways a bit unpredictable, although like Professor Bamberger said, you can look to different countries, you can certainly look at what the purposes of the law, are, and how that fits within the broader construct of pay equity or discrimination that Esta talked about going back 100 years. But ultimately, again, what I'm seeing on the ground is that it is impacting and starting to impact how employers do business. Because while, yes, large public companies that have had shareholder pressure to disclose or to identify measures that they're taking to help close that gender pay equity gap have taken steps in that direction, lots of companies haven't. And lots of companies aren't large publicly held companies, but have other constituents like clients or investors or customers, or people who just use or buy their services who are now also demanding data and disclosure on these types of things. And so as a result of that, you're seeing companies across the spectrum start to look at how they can take those steps and being prepared to be more transparent about it. And that is causing them to look at their pay gaps, their promotion rates, their customer satisfaction, if that's the case with client or customer companies that face customers, the way in which they hire people or compensate them or evaluate people in terms of their jobs. In terms of bearing the burden of enforcement, I mean, certainly the city commission, right, has the ability to enforce this law. And I think that you'll see enforcement really first and foremost where there's low-hanging fruit, meaning companies that just don't comply. I mean, that's easy enough, right? Starting next week, you can check any number of websites or corporate companies to see whether they are complying or not, and check the newspapers and determine whether there's companies that aren't complying, and that will be easy. And in that respect, the city commission has said, look, we'll give you one bite at the apple there too, right? We get it, and if you don't correct that within 30 days, we're going to start the violations. Then you have the next level of enforcement, which is, okay, you've complied, meaning you've put a range in, but is that range something that is constructed in good faith? And there, I think there's going to be less enforcement just because, frankly, there's more room for employers to argue, rightfully so, that we actually did come up with that range in good faith, right? That doesn't mean that we got it right in every instance. Yes, somebody might have walked in the door who was a superstar beyond which we would never have thought we would hire for this position, but they became available and their demands were so high that they were outside the range. I could see that being an argument as to why you might go outside the range. And I think that doesn't necessarily open up a company to grave risk of liability when it comes to the city statute. Of course, Jackie may disagree, but we can debate that. But I think the real concern that's on employers' minds isn't so much strict compliance with the statute, but what does it mean for other cases, like the claims that Esta mentioned, the gender pay equity. Is this going to surface issues in my organization that I don't even know exist yet, right? Am I unintentionally paying women or people of color less than I'm paying, white male employees? That's what's keeping employers up at night. And that might not necessarily be enforcement of this law as much as it is enforcement of the statutes that predate this law and that form the foundation for this law. So that's where I think employers are concerned about enforcement.
Just to say, if anybody's unintentionally
Yeah.
do your research. I mean, I think this is the other thing. We hope that it would shift companies to become better actors in this arena. You have consistent data on average that the gender pay gap exists. And it varies greatly when you combine race in that factor. And then Esther also gave us some wonderful data around men of color. So I think hopefully it removes that excuse.
Yeah.
And from our employers and creates a practice of authenticity, if you will, to because the great benefit to all to improve the economic outcomes of our citizens. And we're having this discussion after coming off of COVID, which has done all kinds of things, certainly to women's employment and engagement in the workforce. And I think there's indication of LGBTQ individuals being disproportionately affected. So I think for, where I land as a government practitioner is this type of society that we want to create for our citizens, that we want this city to be an area, an extremely expensive city, an unaffordable city for most, and pay is one of the ways we help make New York City more livable for all. And I think that's one of the key goals here as well.
What I really like about the regulation, and look, it is burdensome on some employers because they have to look to their ranges. They have to make sure that the ranges are set properly. They might have to do some market pricing and review, but that is all good discipline. What I really like about the regulation is two things. One, that it's focused on new hires, because, as I said, what I see in my work is a lot of the time gaps develop at the point of hire. And the other thing I really do like about it, and this kind of comes back to a lot of what you were talking about, Peter, is that it's about managing to a range. It's not managing to a particular rate for a role. It's managing to a range. And so it allows for an employer to position people properly in that range. And it really isn't full transparency, right? Because you don't know where others are in that range. You just know what the range is. You know where you are in that range. Now you as an employee have the ability to ask questions about why you're in the range. It requires employers now to have greater discipline about how they engage in that pay setting. Now, a lot of them do have that discipline. Not all of them have that discipline. This is pushing that out. Again, pay setting at hire is really critical. By the way, I have seen this year in particular, because there was a lot of compression related to what has become a very hot talent market, people being given some pretty attractive offers to stay on. I've seen that those ad hoc adjustments also have been related to increasing in the gender gap, increases also in the race gaps that I look at. But these ranges, once they're out there, they're not going to be limited to new hires in terms of who can see them. Ultimately, this will progress to all employees. They'll have the ability to see the range. And, again, from my perspective, it's ensuring that companies now have the opportunity. They really need to think about how they will manage those ranges properly, train managers about what it means to position people in that range, hiring managers, recruiting managers, but also the managers that manage these people day to day, and being able to have good conversations with employees about why those employees are positioned where they are, which would reflect on performance. It would reflect on, again, experience, which should be factors differentiating pay.
So I have a question for all of you, because what Peter presented was clear and compelling evidence that this is, at least pieces of this are no-brainers, right? That there's a little bit of downside, but at least communicating the ranges and letting people know where they stand has more benefit than cost. Why is there so much resistance? Why did it take so long for this law to get through? Why are employers so worried about this?
I'm just going to say it's newness and
New?
change,
Yeah.
right? And it seems to come at, I think people are also assessing the responsibility of implementation. And that's huge. It's going to create a greater investment in communication, right? Interacting with individuals about why is my pay in the middle of this range? And that's not a 5-minute conversation, right? That's good. So how are you training your managers and your supervisors to handle this, right? And I think that's not how our workforce currently functions. So we're really shifting the dynamic in the workplace, and therefore productivity measures, how we manage work, in addition to the push for remote work and hybrid work, all kinds of things. So I think we're creating a greater complexity. I would hope that we don't avoid this complexity, and abandon the goal. And so that, I think, would be my.
I think it has a lot to do with tying the hands of management. Managers are accountable to their shareholders, to the owners, and that's a huge responsibility. And they're overworked to begin with, they'll say. And now we're restricting what they can actually do in their flexibility and actually pulling off the objectives that they're supposed to be meeting, and no rewards for doing it, right? If they get it right, they don't get a bonus. Not on this stuff. Very few managers are evaluated about how well they manage the performance of their employees, right? And how well they compensate their employees. That's usually not part of a performance review for managers. It may be an underlying element, but it's a small element and they don't think about it, right? So the bigger issue is, how much time do I have to invest? What kind of conflicts could I potentially get involved in? And that's why we see in study after study that the transparency results in the easy way out, which is just to compress.
So we're shrinking the gap by lowering the relationship, lowering dispersion, but really we're decoupling performance and pay.
In salary,
Salary.
not in total rewards necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I guess what I'll say is, I'm not sensing resistance as much as I'm sensing, kind of a little bit of trepidation, right, and concern about what is to come. Because what I think companies are seeing is we are entering, if not already in, a culture of transparency, right? It's not just that the law is saying be more transparent, or that the shareholders are saying be more transparent. By the way, they are, but employees are saying, I want transparency. I want to know. I have more and more clients calling me today telling me that their employees are just, to the point that you made earlier, their employees are just talking to each other about their pay. Is that okay? Right? The answer is yes, right? You can't do anything about that. And then they're asking me questions about that pay. Like, why am I being paid less than this person? What are your paid statistics as it relates to gender or ethnicity or race? I want to know that, right, from my employer. And years ago, it was very easy for an employer to say, first of all, like, no, okay. I mean, and maybe even say, I don't have that data. And even if I did, the answer is no. But now that's just not an answer that I think most employers understand they can give, right? For a variety of reasons, because either it's the right thing to do because they need to recruit and retain good people, or because they just recognize that that's the culture that we're now entering into, which is a good thing. But this is just another step, right, in that direction that employers, I think, are a little bit concerned, not so much about having to do it, but about getting it right, and making sure that they don't do it in a way that creates more risk, more potential discontent among their employees, and then counteracts all the good things that they've been trying to do in other areas.
And it's getting it right quickly.
Yeah,
Because of
by next Tuesday.
It's the range.
Yeah.
Set the range properly. Is there enough variance in that range? How does it need to compare to market? My competitors are going to see this range now, not just my employees, and maybe we'll have to make some adjustments there. It's just a new area that we have to be thinking about. I mean, that's all going through employers' minds. And then behind all of that, it's, am I comfortable with where every single employee that I have is positioned in the range? Because that's where the questions are going to come from. Because when the employee looks and thinks that they are not positioned properly, that's when the conflicts will occur.
So for people who are not compensation experts and haven't set these ranges before, I'm hearing two things. There's a technical piece. How do we think about setting good faith ranges? And then there's very much a managerial piece. How do we have these interpersonal conversations, and how do we do this? And so maybe we could speak to both. And again, just a quick, like, how should people think about good faith? And I know many people in the room know what market pricing means, but maybe not everyone does. How can people learn more about this and do a better job on both ends, the technical aspects and the managerial aspects?
Yeah. Well, look, on the compensation front, I'm not the expert on going to the market data and positioning, but obviously there's a process on that front. It is important to do analysis and make sure that you're comfortable with where each employee sits in the range, because the internal comparisons matter too. And then arming managers with the right speaking points, right? If you're a large organization, you're not going to be able to support each manager with a specific reason for why each and every employee is positioned where they're positioned. And by the way, I'm talking about all employees, not just new hires, because I do think that the applicability of this is going to be ultimately broader. But you have to position those managers with the ability to have those conversations. And it's going to be, in some cases, potentially sensitive conversations. Now, skilled managers have to be able to have those conversations, because it's not always about experience. It's not always about the credentials. Sometimes it's about performance. And when you are in a performance discussion that links to pay, those discussions will get sensitive, but ultimately you have to have them.
Mm-hmm. Peter, do you want to jump in on this?
Well, I think, you mentioned market pricing, and Brian, you talked about the representation explanations. So everything we've been talking about is about ranges and positioning within ranges, but we haven't really had any discussion of how we price different ranges. And the transparency regulations have nothing on that. And what we've seen over the years is that employers have moved away from doing what we often refer to in compensation as these internal equity assessments, looking at how we price certain jobs relative to others within the organization. Because if you price the jobs that are predominantly male more than the jobs that are predominantly female, in a court, you're going to be in trouble. So it's a lot easier to go with market pricing and say, hey, it's not me, it's the market. You can't blame me. I'm just pricing according to the market. So as long as we focus strictly on ranges and this market pricing element without looking at how we price different jobs within the organization and these different ranges, and employees aren't necessarily going to be able to see the ranges of other positions with, I don't know, maybe they will be. We're only dealing with a small part of this issue of the broader pay gap issue.
And broader societal inequality issues. Yeah. Great.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
mean,
government, I'm sorry, government workers, we've had our salaries public forever. Nonprofit sector, if you're in the top 5 in your 990s, go to the first thing I go to, right? So it's so interesting to see this reticence and hesitancy in the for-profit space. There's some of us who, my salary's there, and I've been in the public sector for 5 years, and people can find it, and everybody knows what a mayor executive makes. So the challenge is equipping managers to effectively deal with. It's a new skill set, no doubt, that has to be acquired and deepened. And people have to get smart about it, because at the end of it is our, fines for noncompliance, and then the larger potential lawsuits that I'm sure everybody's afraid of, and which is also not where we want to go with this. Okay, that's not the goal here. And I must, when we talk about transparency in this current period we're in, I have to think about social media as well, and how much the younger generation, it's like, when I grew up, it was like, you don't talk about your salary. The younger generation, they don't care. This is where we're at. This is what I earn, and they're using it to support each other, to help people earn more and to be better earners and to live the lifestyles that they want to live. So I think that's the other pressure, the cultural pressure that I think we're in at this moment. So I think we should, as corporations, yield to this moment and develop and be flexible and be the innovators that we have, lauded our private sector for, and just get it done. As our mayor says, we're going to get stuff done. And this.
I think a great model is asymmetry in medicine as well, which has changed over the years. So if you look at, what's happened in medicine, today patients are much more educated, partially because of social media and the access to medical information, which changes the nature of patient-doctor relationships. Doctors have to spend a lot more time with educated patients. Time that they don't really have, but in the end, my wife is a physician and she seems to think that this is actually beneficial for the entire process, making the physician much more accountable, having to deal with questions that they might have just dismissed. So that's consistent with what you're saying as well.
We're arming employees with more information, but we're also then increasing the burden on both sides to engage in this productively. Thank you all very much for your expertise. I'd like to turn us over and invite our audience to ask questions that they might have. And we have hands shooting up.
And we have one.
And we have one
couple.
from online. So let's start here in the back. I see Brian Dunn. Yes. No? Well, I didn't.
Hi, how are you? I'm Chip Cutter. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Really interested in panel. Jackie, I was wondering if you could address the point that was raised here about possible loopholes. For example, going to a search firm. Would a search firm have to comply with this then? I just wonder if you could speak to that point.
I'm looking here at the guidance that the New York City Commission on Human Rights provides, and there is this a temporary health firm exception. Okay, so clearly when a search firm is going out, they are reporting for a client, and that client should provide the range. So the obligation is on the client. Now, the search firm to their employees needs to provide that range, okay? So I think that's and so the question is, the search firm is obligated to its workforce to provide ranges, but the client that it works with is the responsibility lies with them for the position that they're supporting. Does that make sense?
Already who are saying they see this as a potential way to get around the law. So if you're a private equity firm that doesn't want to post ranges, perhaps you hire an executive search firm to find someone. And I wonder if that's sort of.
Yeah, it's there. And as I was reading the guidance, I thought, okay, here's a loophole. But but I am going to say again, this is where I can't think of a private equity firm. I don't go for a job where I don't see a search, where I don't see salary ranges, but I'm in a different space. Yeah.
So I think, the landscape on the search firm is basically the following. So the law applies to an employer and its agents and its agencies. So if I'm an employer and I hire a company to conduct a search for me, right, that company would be subject to the law as an agent or an agency of the employer. But remember, the law applies to advertisements. That's an important point. The law applies to advertisements. So it doesn't apply if I, as an employer, or my employment agency, recruiter, reaches out to individual candidates and says, hey, there's a job at this company. This is the position. This is what they're looking for. That's not an advertisement, right? At least is my reading on the guidance. An advertisement is something that's more public facing, intended to be distributed to some number of employees. Could be in writing, in the newspaper, online, or even on, an employer's own website. But if it's an advertisement, it has to have that range posted. Yeah. And so I don't know that it's a loophole, right? As much as it is, the law is intended to really cover, and I think, an employer's advertising or posting of a job, as opposed to I'm conducting a search for a new CFO, right? That's a different set of circumstances.
Let's get the two here and then we'll do online. Yeah.
Peter, we've seen lots of academic research that show that women tend not to apply to the same jobs that men apply to, or don't have the same level of confidence in terms of the skills required to apply for a job. Are you worried that this will only exacerbate the situations, that men will more naturally be more aggressive in negotiating than women will be?
Yeah, I think most of the research is more in terms of the negotiating than applications, at least from what I've seen. I don't see this. I think the symmetry in pay information is actually going to boost the hands of everyone negotiating, and the people who are at the weaker end of negotiating tend to be. We do have evidence that women are weaker in negotiations under certain conditions. My sense is that where there's greater symmetry in information, these kinds of differences are probably going to be narrowed. So, but again, I don't know of any research that's actually, it's a really interesting question. I can't answer it based on any evidence. It's just my gut feeling.
The hope again is with more information, right? You're reducing the need for this negotiation, right? And let me say, in concert with the salary history ban. And so you pair the salary transparency in job advertisements with the salary history ban. When you get to a table, you hope that what you have in front of you on an advertisement is a true good faith salary, right? And then that pressure for negotiation, you hope, is reduced. I think that's what we're driving for, at least one side of this.
We have a question from our online audience.
Several questions. We have several questions, so we'll start with the first one. The question is about discretionary bonus component of total compensation. That's a big aspect of pay for financial services and professional services. So how does that bonus component fit into this discussion?
It does not. And that's where we see a vulnerability, right? This is not a total compensation transparency bill. This is a salary, so it's your base pay. And then everything else, as Peter's research indicates, that's where the incentives go. And then under our current construct, they remain hidden. And so, you say, will this pay gaps are real? Is pay transparency the answer? Not if it's just salary, clearly.
But in order to deal with that issue, I mean, you're hinting a little bit at the need for transparency in performance reviews, which is a huge area that hasn't been touched at all. The degree to which employees can see the reviews of other employees, and that's super contentious.
And that also means that managers should do good performance reviews, which they do not do. People are afraid to do a good performance review. But let me give one more question.
Can I just comment on that one though? So I'm not arguing for expansion of the regulation here. But I would offer that companies looking at this issue proactively are generally looking at total compensation as well as base. So it's one thing that I would say is a solution is not always through regulation. Sometimes the markets take care of things. And what I've seen over the last few years is we've moved from an environment of compliance to one where really increased transparency in terms of what shareholders are demanding, employees are demanding, what's available online has driven organizations to make a lot of change and a lot of good change.
Another question. The private sector is competitive. Government and nonprofits are not. Do we want to drive the innovative work to other geographies?
This is a major concern, right? So the research of Moss looking at city managers in California, this natural experiment when pay became transparent in the public sector in California, what happened to the top performers with pay compression? Exactly what I was talking about before. They basically left those municipalities and went to greener pastures. So yes, this is definitely a concern.
Behind you had a question. Asha, did you have a question first?
Hi. Well, it was actually covered. I was going to ask about the short-term incentives and what we think would happen since it's not looking at total comp, right? So it could be detrimental, right? In terms of gaps, it could create larger gaps in terms of the comp that we're not looking at. Paired with that, just thinking about, I think Brian mentioned it, pay equity, right? I think for the most part, I do a pay equity analysis, and you do have that 99 cents to the dollar for gender and race. But where it really comes into play is the opportunity gaps, right? And the representation gaps. And this doesn't address that. And could it potentially also kind of further those gaps as well? Because it's only looking at comp and not looking at, as we were talking about, the opportunities that people aren't getting, or it's not closing those gaps at all whatsoever.
Yeah, if you look at the ESG reports of companies disclosing, usually they consist of a few different pieces. One will be, here's where we stand on pay equity. When we look at like for like employees, we make that comparison, here's where we stand. Beyond that, they will also often share something about representation of women and people of color at different levels of the hierarchy. Now, how they report on that differs, but they do generally share something about that. Sometimes they'll share something about the goals that they have to increase representation, and they'll also share something about their policies and practices, examples of what they're doing to promote those things. All of that has happened without any regulatory requirement per se, and it continues to develop. So I think that, I'm bringing this up because I think that over some time, we will see some improvement on that front, just from pressure from investors. And it's not just the activist investors, right? It's just investors who are concerned about ESG. They're building their portfolio on that basis, and companies are responding to that. They want to do the right thing anyway. Honestly, the companies I'm working with are very much focused on that. But that pressure is in the system, and it's increasing.
But, and I understand not wanting to rush everything into regulation. I get it. But the wait has been extraordinarily long. Right. And I think that's what we're saying here, that this persistence of, let the system take care of it, or the market take care of it, or companies are being encouraged, it hasn't worked. And, the loss incurred because it hasn't worked is significant and detrimental, not only to women, but to families and to communities. And you have a consistent and persistent underinvestment that seems concentrated in communities of color, that when you have pandemics, further decimates and derails. We talked a lot about this being a she session at the beginning of this pandemic and the tremendous loss that women felt. So, and I appreciate the activist shareholder, they're cyclical. And so this is why, for me, I'm concerned about this lack of consistency in pursuing the goal.
Right. So look, I'm not sitting here arguing that the market is going to take care of everything, but I am saying that the world is different than it was 5 years ago. Peter talked a lot about asymmetry of information. Information is becoming more available, and economists know when information is out there, when you have limited asymmetries, the markets function better. And so now we're in a position where I think we will see more progress by virtue of that information being out there.
Yeah, there's a medium level intervention which has to do with safe harbors. Right? So you can move the market more in these directions by providing safe harbors, and there has been some discussion about that without necessarily imposing regulation. So companies that are moving more in that direction potentially would have a better basis for protecting themselves if the claims were ever raised.
I think, listen, I think I would say that change has been a long time coming for sure. And I think government regulation, hasn't been as significant in this area as it has been in the last 5 years. You can see just with the salary history ban law, the proliferation of the pay transparency laws. In 5 years, we're going to be here talking about something else, right? I'm not sure what that something else is yet, but we are going to be talking about it, right? Maybe it's going to be informed by what other countries are doing. Maybe it's going to be informed by what California or New York City as a leader in this space is doing. But I also agree with Brian that, I've been getting questions about this more in the last 5 years than I had in the 15 years before that, not just because shareholders, investors, or employees are interested and want to know. They are, and they do, but also because employers are. I mean, the clients who I'm speaking to, they do care about these issues. They want to be leaders in this space. And so agreed that it's not going to be driven completely by the market. Agreed there's going to have to be some more government regulation in this space. But I don't want to take that away from the fact that there are, well-meaning, well-intentioned people out there who care very deeply about these issues.
I think it's a both and.
Yeah.
And allow me to give a plug for the Commission on Gender Equity's Leveling the Playing Field report, best practices for gender pay equity in the workplace. And we really put this together in 2018. And it just encourages a simple resource guide for companies to look at how they can systemically address this. And again, the goal is to close the pay and racial gap, gender pay and racial pay gap, and then to sustain it, right? So that's really the marker. We want to be able to sustain it so that we never have to have this cyclical thing. And I do think yes, there are good players. There are even some great players. And, but that has to become more widely the system and the way we operate.
Mm-hmm. Great. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Something on my mind that we're talking about. Oh, thank you. Something on my mind in that we have gone through a financial meltdown only 14 years ago. A lot of people laid off, a lot of minorities laid off. Then COVID comes, triple the damage because everything had to shut down for the first time in our history as far as I'm concerned. So from a legal perspective, when you put these ranges, I feel like companies may say, well, we're going to play a game here. We're going to interview people, but we're going to push the salaries down. So we're not going to give them the top because they need jobs. So it's all these dynamics that are taking place that when they're thinking about, and from what I hear, a recession may be around the corner. So it's like compounding even more the problem, especially that women have left the workforce in record numbers. So from a legal perspective, how do you deal with this dynamics?
I hear you. I think that a couple of things. One, from a business perspective, employers are thinking about ranges that are going to be satisfactory in order to comply with the law. But I think you also need to be thinking about ranges that are going to attract talent to this particular job, right? Because ultimately that's what you're looking for, is a good employee. And number two, to the extent that there is the possibility that employers could post a range that is between, 50 and 100, but tends to give offers closer to 50 because they want to drive down, the cost of employees. The purpose of the transparency law in part is to tell everyone who's going to apply for that job that this is what I'm prepared to pay, right? So it takes away some of the ambiguity or the secrecy around it. In other words, if before this law, if somebody got an offer at 55, they didn't know that this company was prepared to pay up to 100. Now they do, right? So it puts that applicant in the position to say, why am I not getting that better offer? What about my credentials, my experience, my skills is causing you to give me an offer at that rate, at that level? And I think in part that's the reason for the law, right? It's transparency. So I think employers will find it difficult to do that with some frequency because A, it's going to put them in a tough situation with those applicants who, by the way, they do want to hire, right? And B, if they're going to have ranges that are narrower or lower, then they might be undercutting their ability to get quality candidates into the door.
We have another online question and then we'll come to the back.
So remote work, the question really goes in two different directions. The headquarters is in New York City, but the person is working in Massachusetts.
Right.
Or the company is in Massachusetts and the person is working in New York City. How does this law apply?
So the guidance says that the employer has to comply with this posting requirement, meaning the range, as long as the job, and just to get the wording right, can or will be performed in whole or in part in New York City. That's the language. So if you're posting for a remote job that can be worked anywhere, including New York City, the advice is to put the range in there, right? Because you're not excluding people from New York City in this job posting. And so to the extent that you actually could hire someone who lives in New York City, then you have to include the range. When it comes to an employee, let's say, who you're hiring to work in Massachusetts, and you're looking for that person, and you are based in New York, this is not going to apply to you, because the advertisement is not for a position that can or will be worked in whole or in part in New York. And generally, the New York City human rights law applies to an employee where the statute has an impact on that employee in New York City. So if you're talking about someone who's never going to step foot in New York, the law is not going to apply to them.
So we've actually seen some interesting cases about this, like with Google,
Yeah.
which hires people and makes it very clear that they cannot work in Colorado, which has a,
Colorado is exactly right. Colorado has a law that came out a few years ago that is, in fact, even a bit more robust than the New York City law.
Great. Linda.
I'm wondering if there's evidence in the research that this could have a positive ripple elsewhere. Jackie, you mentioned New York City being a leader. So if I'm applying in a labor market where we're still well under 5% unemployment, and I see two different ads, one has a range, one doesn't, why would I apply to the company that's not willing to give me that information? So I'm thinking in your experiments, Peter, in what you've seen anecdotally, how might New York City end up impacting a much bigger range of jobs just because talent has the upper hand right now on the recruiting market?
I think there are two factors that come into play there. One is the nature of the range that's been advertised, right? So if it's a very, very attractive range, then certainly I'm going to go with the New York City job with the attractive range as opposed to a company that doesn't advertise its range, right? Where I have to guess, and as we heard, it may not be in my favor. The other element is that we know from companies like Buffer and some of the other companies that I studied that actually have explicit person-based pay information, that attracts a certain type of employee and a surprisingly larger and larger number of younger generation employees that are actually looking to work in these kinds of organizations where pay is kind of taken off the playing field and it's an open issue, and they don't want that secrecy as part of the broader environment. And those types of employees are attracted to those organizations. When I first was asked those questions about is pay transparency good or bad, teaching those MBA students were tech entrepreneurs. That's the group that I was teaching. And a lot of them already had an orientation. This was in Israel. A lot of them were already having that orientation that they wanted to design their organizations around this notion of greater transparency. They had worked in big corporations, they were escaping from that, and they wanted to go to something else. And this was 15 years ago. So we are seeing movements, especially in tech, in that direction.
And we're seeing the technology enable it. So increasingly you can go to salary.com and go to their app that says, what am I worth? And type
And I heard
in.
there's a new TikTok station
yes.
about this as well, where like 2 million hits in the last 3 months, right? So.
Right, good, good. We have another question over here.
Hi, going back on what you were talking about, Google excluding workers in Colorado, can you see this having a negative impact on the New York City labor market and seeing some companies excluding New York City workers to not comply?
I'm not from New York, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we have to be mindful of. I'm sorry, in my mind, I'm being a little New Yorker. I'm like, we're in New York. So we'll figure it out.
Who wouldn't want to work here?
Yeah,
right?
right. So, but no, this, part of any piece of legislation that we pass, a question I ask myself is effectiveness. Will it get the job done? And so this would be something that I would love to find a way to measure, right? To constantly follow it to see the shifts, because we have to be, Peter talked a lot when we were prepping about unintended negative consequences, right? Certainly that wouldn't be a goal that we want here. So I would say that's some work we have to do to look at and be mindful that that could be a possible outcome.
Look, I think it's a major issue in the United States where you have very, very different labor laws from one state to another. And as a result, you can see certain employers avoiding New York City or New York State because of the regulatory environment. So there's no reason to think that this would not be similar to that.
I think, look, New York City is not the first nor the last to pass this law. So, I think this is a new standard. You see it in Connecticut, you got it in California, you got it in Colorado. A lot of employers are just going to be posting their ranges everywhere because it's just too hard to post in one and not in another. And then you have questions from employees and you have questions from applicants anyway, and your competitor is putting it out, so you have to put it out. So I on the margin, sure, it could potentially push employers out of a location, but I think it's going to have a pretty modest effect given all of the momentum behind this.
I agree.
We have another online question and then a few more in the audience.
So this goes to good faith and a very interesting, I think, set of facts. At this firm, the rule is that everyone is paid the same and we do not negotiate a rate. We are sensitive to providing our competitors with our exact rate because it's a very competitive market. So how do they comply with the requirements of this law? Do they post the exact rate? Would it be better for them to create a range around the rate? What is the solution for them going forward?
It provides.
Yeah, no, the guidance does provide that if the employer is paying a rate, then that is the rate, right, to display. And I think that creating a range for the sake of showing a range, is risky. Listen, I also think that if they're in a competitive environment and they're a company that pays everyone the same, or there's some metric that they use, I think they could assume that their competitors know what that is. I mean, in the real world. So I'm not sure that, that warrants, some differential treatment because they're a company that pays everyone the same. I don't know, Jackie, do you have a view on that?
No, I agree 100%. The issue here is authenticity, right? Just be truthful about what you do. And if your behavior, and it's a known, that you pay a rate and everybody gets the same rate, then you advertise that rate. And that's all the law is asking you. It's not asking you to behave differently than your truthful behavior.
Listen, you see that sometimes in collective bargaining where there's, the union has negotiated a rate and that's just what it is, right? And it happens in the public sector, it happens in government all the time. So I don't think that's unusual.
Okay, we have two more questions here in the audience.
Oh, thanks. First, I want to say thanks for the great conversation. Even though it's been mostly from like the employer, manager, CEO perspective, I think it's possible to infer the benefits that workers will receive from this law. So I was wondering, has there been any research about how salary transparency will impact occupational segregation, which was, I think, a big driver of pay gaps? And also I was wondering about, there's a specific example of workers who were kind of not treating other workers badly when they found out about the pay rates. I was wondering if there's anything that you think would mitigate that effect, perhaps like you said the word union, possibly unionization or things along those lines. Thanks.
So I'm going to answer the second question because I don't know of any evidence in terms of occupational segregation and its implications on that. I haven't done any work on that, but that deals a little bit with what we were talking, before about the representation explanations and differences in pay for different types of jobs. And again, we have no regulation on that I'm familiar with anywhere, and if anything, we're moving away from that. So I'll let you.
I think has to started us out with this, that the comparable worth debate didn't go anywhere. And that was what the spirit of that was. And the current methodologies for analyzing pay gaps are within the same job. And so we don't know that these tools are not going to help us with that. And in fact, they almost reify and reaffirm that it's okay
because we're comparing within, not between. And so that's are unions going to be able to do that? I don't know, because it's not the way that the problem is framed. And the old framing didn't work. The framing of comparable worth, teacher, sanitation worker, that didn't work. This notion of justice and people wanting more justice and equality and pushing for that and using their economic power to patronize the places that provide it, or using their investment dollars to support companies that are more equal. Maybe that's where it comes from, but it feels like some of the tools we're talking about don't go there.
Right, but I do think in the broader discussion of pay equity, we can't ignore occupational segregation, right? Because we concentrate women, people of color, women of color in lower paying jobs. And this idea of representation is sort of has to occur throughout the hierarchy, if you will, on that, right? So, and does representation help us? Well, it should break some of that occupational segregation, giving, I hope, people of color, women, greater access to greater job opportunities. But how does a workforce get that done? It is still the question. And this wouldn't be the law, I think, that gets us there. But the bigger picture of that 83 cents, will remain if we don't address this occupational segregation issue. It's just simple as that.
Unless we get the positive sorting that Peter talked about, and as people realize, these are not very good jobs and these are good jobs, and maybe I better figure out how to get there.
But also, I think the positive sorting, which was sort of the underperformer leaving, right? It's this. There's another discussion that we're kind of. It's about what type of workforce do we create, right? Ultimately, I think that's what we're looking at, and transparency needs to be a factor. Growth opportunity needs to be an element of a good, healthy workforce. And I think those are the things that we then believe will lead us to pay equity, right? And a sustained pay equity, right? So, and we're not there yet, which is why these pieces of legislations are chipping away. And part of the challenge is the definition that we have. And, because we kind of have to be solid on what are we trying to accomplish.
So one way of dealing with this occupational issue is to go as far as Norway went, which is to make everyone's tax returns open and public on the internet. And it absolutely reduces pay inequality or inequality in the society. If that's the direction we want to go to, I don't see that happening too soon in the United States.
Yeah.
In terms of mitigating the negative consequences, employee to employee, that you asked about, the answer there, it seems to be in impacting perceptions of unfair treatment. And there are a variety of ways to do that, but perhaps the easiest and best way to do that is through pay process transparency, providing employees with a greater understanding of why it is that they're not making as much as someone else. And those conversations often don't take place or aren't as detailed as they should be or evidence-based as they should be in many workplaces.
We have one more question from the audience, and then I'll give you, I know you've been trying to get in. Yeah.
No, thank you to the panelists for, this has been great, and the audience too for the great questions as well. I'm not an expert in any means in Canadian law, but from what I remember from provincial legislation might exist that includes salary history bans, as well as also pay disclosure laws and pay range laws. And I think there might be one in Ontario. And I was just curious what empirical data exists on the effectiveness of that, because if I recall, there is still a pay gap of comparable to what we're seeing here in the United States.
So Ontario did pass pay transparency law. And the study that I mentioned earlier, I believe, was from Ontario and the university system there, which was a reduction of 30%. I mean, the pay gap was not huge. It was about a 7% pay gap, and it was reduced by 2 percentage points. So that's a 30% reduction in the pay gap within a year,
Hmm.
which is pretty amazing, right? And it's similar to what happened in Denmark over the course of a year, and it was maintained. We know from Denmark, where it was passed in 2016, it's been maintained.
I want to thank all of you for being here, for being part of this. Thank you to Peter for educating us on the latest in pay transparency research, and to all of our panelists. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Last word.
I want to add my word of thanks that Diane just gave. I learned a great deal from today's panel. I hope you did as well. I think we're going to be watching this at ILR very closely because I think this is such an important issue. And I wish there was a better way, frankly, to deal with occupational segregation, because pay equity and occupational segregation have to go together. And so this is something that I think we're all going to be looking at. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
It's great.